Hello, everyone, and welcome to the observation deck. I am Annie Peterson Colette-Carr, your host, and with me today is retired meteorologist Sharon Alden. Sharon,
Hello.
welcome.
Thank you. Hello, Annie.
It's so nice to see you again. I had the pleasure of Sharon coming to visit me in Los Angeles very recently. She was traveling from Texas here to see family, and then she went home to Alaska, where she is right now. And wow, did she have an exciting career? And I'm so delighted I get to bring her to this podcast and share with you how, like everyone else that you're going to meet here, has a background with boats on the water. And in our case, we were Sea Scouts together on an all-girls ship in San Francisco Bay. And Sharon always had a passion for the outdoors and for weather. And Sharon went on to become a meteorologist at San Francisco State University, and then had a very interesting career supporting the public, supporting aviation. In fact, I told Sharon this story and she didn't know it, but she answered the phone at Weather Services when my dad was actually in San Francisco Tower at the airport. And he heard the call between her and the air traffic controllers one day. And I was like, oh, I for some reason, I thought it was my dad on the phone, but he just overheard the call. So that was pretty special to think that you had that far a reach. And so with marine activity, anything you learn and do around boats actually translates out into the world. So I am delighted that Sharon's here to share with us how her experience on the water actually created a very fruitful and varied career for her. So Sharon, why don't you start by telling us the first time you ever stepped foot on a boat?
Ooh, first time I ever set foot on a boat that I can recall. You know, when I was 2.5, we went to the Statue of Liberty, but I don't recall that boat.
Okay.
I do recall later on that big, epic family vacation, maybe I was 3, being on the boat at the Niagara Falls. And then later, our family was traveling in Europe, and I was 7 or 8 and getting seasick going across from Finland to Sweden in the North Sea. There, it was pretty rough.
Yeah.
As far as sailing goes in the Sea Scouts, we had some family friends who had a small heavy duty styrofoam sailboat. And they're the ones who actually taught me how to sail, as in ready about, helms a lee, and duck as the boom crosses, on a small lake near South Lake Tahoe. This was, a large pond that we kids were learning to sail. And it had a dagger board for the keel, and you had to pull that up when you dragged it up on the beach.
How wonderful.
And I was afraid of water growing up. Didn't really learn to swim till I was 14. And sort of sea scared. My joke was that I must be reincarnated from a drowned sailor because I'm afraid of water and drowning, but yet I love sailing.
Awesome.
Yes, and just the experiences in the Sea Scouts and sailing on the bay, it's so beautiful and it's so exciting. And I'd often have a little anxiety or fear just as we were starting out, but as soon as you get going, it's addicting.
It is addicting. I know exactly what you mean. I'm sure many of our listeners know too. And I hope there are some that are curious enough to want to go mess around with boats after listening to a few of these podcasts, because every single person has had such a unique adventure. It's time you make your own stories and get out there and enjoy the water. So
Yes.
Sharon, let's talk meteorology, because in Sea Scouts, we also had to learn about the weather. Now, we lived in San Francisco, which has a very rich array of weather patterns and tidal patterns, which are influenced by weather and more. So, yeah, take it away. What
Well,
was that
let's
like?
see. Well, one thing about the weather in San Francisco, it's not, like you said, rich, but really compared to other places, it's a little benign. We don't get a lot of severe weather. And you and I grew up in the same neighborhood on the west side of San Francisco. We grew up in the fog, in a lot of fog.
A lot. Pea
A
soup.
lot. But family vacations and trips to the Sierras when there were thunderstorms were just absolutely fascinating to me. I remember being up on a hilltop in a thunderstorm in the Sierras and seeing, foolishly, I would never do that now, lightning hitting a power pole below us. We ran down that hill very fast. My mom was not happy that, dad and the kids were up there. but the interactions between the topography, the wind, and the currents in the bay are just so, I don't know, interesting. It kind of tweaks the nerd in me, or I really enjoyed when we were sailing and sail racing, looking at the little tide table booklets and figuring out when the tide was turning and where the currents would turn first, so you could take advantage of that. And that was really interesting and really satisfying. Another interesting, I've always been accused of like having my head in the clouds. And when I was younger, I was like, I don't want to be a meteorologist. That sounds hard. I want to be a weather observer and just watch it. But once I grew up, I'm like, yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to know what's going on and the why. And when I look at a thunderstorm, I look at the structure of the cloud. It's where's the inflow, is the outflow started yet? Has the rain started yet? How are the towers growing? Is there any circulation associated with the thunderstorm? And I liked looking at the sky and trying to figure out what's going on. But the years that I went to college at San Francisco State, also a very foggy location, it was the early 90s, that very strong El Nino pattern, 92 and 93, sort of it was, there hadn't been that many double year El Ninos, and that in that year, those years resulted in very strong winter storms, torrential rains, like double the normal annual precipitation, nearly for San Francisco for a couple of those years, resulted in, big storms that maybe wasn't the best day to be sailing across the bay, but we needed to go anyway. So I got to learn a lot about some of those larger global patterns and the interactions between and feedbacks between the ocean and the atmosphere. El Nino patterns are when the coast, it's defined by sea surface temperatures in the equatorial Pacific. And what happens in California is the sea surface temperatures are warmer, and those changes in the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific as a whole tend to alter the paths of the major storms, and sometimes make them a little more vigorous, because of how it changes the larger patterns that steer our weather systems. So not every El Nino year is going to be a big, wet, soggy year. And those are the things I learned, not just in college, but through the career.
So in college, did you have an opportunity to study more local patterns, or is it very well balanced? I'm just curious about that. That popped into my awareness.
Um, we did study more local patterns. There was sort of a focus on California weather, but yes, globally, it's how the whole systems work, how our global atmosphere circulates, and the basics of hot air rises, cold air sinks, the sun heats this area up more than that area, and our weather that we get is just a result of the atmosphere trying to balance out where it's heated more, where it's not as hot, where it's cooling off more. And like I said, the interactions with the ocean are really interesting because that's sort of a dampening factor. And if you talk to sailors who are going on the East Coast, they'll be looking at how things react with the Gulf Stream and those warmer temperatures coming from the Caribbean up offshore of the East Coast in the Atlantic and up towards Western Europe.
And the adventures of Yacht Boy take place in the Bahamas and the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I'm very much going to be getting into more of weather issues for the Caribbean areas. So those were I spent a lot of time in Antigua in the West Indies, and that was really my first exposure to it's a pretty dry climate. It's like California. It's very arid, but when it does rain, wow, torrential. And I had lived in Mexico on the Western Caribbean shores for a couple months in a palapa, and it was very just phenomenal when it would rain. And the year that I was there last was a long time ago, but a cold front from the Arctic had moved down into the Texas Gulf and down into the Caribbean. And I did not have enough clothing. I literally had to put on everything I owned. And I thought, it's the Caribbean.
Of course.
I don't need a jacket. I don't need anything but shorts and a swimsuit and flip-flops. And wow, that was pretty amazing to see that weather from the Arctic come all the way down into a very tropical region.
What's interesting about the Central Plains there is there are no big mountain ranges between the Arctic Ocean and, the Texas coast.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a straight shot. If the weather pattern's just right,
it gets a free pass.
Yes.
Oh, please,
nothing gets in the way. And that's why those regions east of the Rockies can have some really crazy extreme flip-flops from very warm to very cold back to very warm again.
First time I was in Chicago, I was we
windy
stayed
city.
Yes, and we stayed overnight. It was June, and we stayed overnight at a hotel near the airport because we had an early flight. And the lightning and the thunder was right overhead, and it kept putting out the power. It was that strong, and the whole building would shake, rattle, and roll. And I was just like, wow, I've never been in thunder like this. I literally was inside the thunder. I'd never experienced that before. And it was mind blowing. I can still pull up that memory and remember it very well.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to move into some of your were you a ranger per se for the
Park Service?
Yes.
No, not at all. It was an odd job. So sort of as a result of the tragic deaths on fires in 1994, where a group of firefighters were burned over, the land management agencies wanted to be better prepared with weather and weather information. So they decided to hire, this took several years. So that happened in 94. So around the turn of the century, the program was called Predictive Services. And the idea was that they would have meteorologists and fire behavior specialists working in one of the 11 or 12 regional coordination centers across the US to specifically deal with weather information. So the forecasts may still be coming from the National Weather Service, but they would be sort of supplemented by meteorologists working in the coordination centers, helping to communicate that information to make sure it got to the people that needed it. And not just what's happening today or tomorrow, but 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or what's coming up next season. We did make an attempt to forecast seasonally, but at some areas it's easier than others. Long-term drought in some areas plays a big part of things, and the idea was that we will have these meteorologists. Well, the different land management agencies pulled their money together. So some of the positions are Bureau of Land Management, some are U.S. Forest Service, some are Fish and Wildlife, and in Alaska, it just so happened that it was a National Park Service job. So my little quip was, I work for all of the agencies, but the National Park Service pays my salary. But that was from National Fire Plan money. So like I said, it's a little odd situation. So I was not attached to any park. I worked in a BLM office, so a Bureau of Land Management office. My operational supervisor worked for the Bureau of Land Management, and most of my colleagues and people that I worked near were Bureau of Land Management, but they're also State of Alaska employees that worked in the Interagency Coordination Center. And it was really a fascinatingly effective and functional interagency situation. There were no turf wars, and it was, our common goal was managing fire safely and appropriately, and being prepared. Part of this motto.
You're already trained for. So you were a smoke spotter, and what else?
Not smoke spotter.
Oh, okay.
I never worked as a fire spotter or observer of fires. When I was with the National Weather Service, I was a general forecaster and then a lead forecaster. There's several quote unquote lead forecasters in an office. And my job was public forecasting, also aviation forecasting, marine forecasting, where you're forecasting not just the winds, but the waves, and also fire weather, where you're putting an extra focus on relative humidities as well as winds. So wind and relative humidity are the two main things that say what's the fire going to do. And with that, I got trained to be an incident meteorologist. So I would go out to a large fire. They send out what's called an incident management team. Type 1 or Type 2 are the sort of highest levels. The Type 1 teams, if it's a very complex fire or near significant population, it'll be a Type 1. And it has to do with the complexity of the terrain, the human resources that are around that are at risk, and also the amount of communication that the team needs to put out. So they're not just fighting the fire, they're helping to coordinate evacuations and things like that. So my first opportunity, my first training fire, was in Southeast Arizona in the Chiricahua Mountains. And, our job was to work very closely with the fire behavior analyst. And their job is to tell the firefighters, here's what you can expect from the fire today. And that information was based on the weather. So we were working remotely, working out of the back of a rental moving van. And so there was a contractor with the big satellite dish to get the download of the forecast models, and I would interpret those and apply them to the local area and local terrain with winds and humidities, and collect observations from the field. The firefighters would take weather observations through the day, and if you're doing your job right, the firefighters are not surprised by what they see when they go out there. So that was my rule of thumb, was that if somebody experiences through the day what they expected to experience and see, then I did my job.
Awesome.
And I had one day where the fire behavior analyst came up to me that evening at dinner and said, "What happened to your wind forecast today?" And the thing with forecasting weather is you are going to be wrong about something every day. And it's just adjusting, doing your best, communicating your doubts, yes, this is going to happen, or this might happen. I expect the winds to come up, but here's the range of times in the afternoon that the winds are going to increase, or when I expect thunderstorms to develop. Uncertainty, communicating your uncertainty.
Yeah.
It does not pay to be confident, overly confident. You need to express the uncertainties that you have.
Young navigator books would say that's about being authentic in your relating. And we want to be optimal communicators. We want to set the listening. So that means we have to let go of our self-judgments, our uncertainties, our doubts, to be able to present what we're sharing, right? And then we can say, hey, there is some variables in here. This could all change. This is the best I can do in this moment, but I'll be checking in and getting back to you. When we cultivate in ourselves that optimal style of relating in our communication, we are more conscious about how we relate to people and how we want to relate to people. And you're right, there is no room when lives are on the line for a cocky attitude.
Yes, and it's expressing the forecast confidently, but confidently expressing, your maybe lack of confidence in a particular aspect. And I used to always joke that you can't be a perfectionist and be a weather forecaster, because you will never be perfect. And people that are perfectionists have a really tough time with it. And it's just being clear with what you know and clear with what you don't know. Because if you're confident about something, or if you express confidence in something that you aren't really confident about, it'll go the other way. They'll figure it out, and they will lose confidence in you. If you express your doubts about a particular aspect of the forecast, people will respect that. And just telling your focus is to know the weather on that fire. And if you express everything you know clearly, and that's the other thing, it's all about communication. If you know the forecast but you don't express it clearly, you're useless.
Good point. So what was the worst fire that you were in your whole career? I know a lot of people will be curious to know.
None of the fires I worked on, and actually I had a fairly long career, but I did not go and work on that many fires altogether. I never had a major injury or fatality on any of the fires I worked on. Did have one fire that came to visit fire camp. And that was my first fire where I was no longer a trainee. And
could you define fire camp for us?
Oh, fire camp, that's where everybody's camped out. That's working on the fire. So fire camp consists of overhead. So I would be part of overhead. So I'm not physically going out and fighting the fire, But there will also be people camped there that are actually going out every day and, say, digging a fire line or cutting trees down or setting back fires. But at fire camp, there are also people who are, well, there on that fire, there was a recycling crew, because you're setting up a small town.
Yeah.
And so that's what it is. You had the contractors who are doing catering, people working in the kitchens. You're feeding a whole bunch of people. Plans. They usually rent a Xerox machine so they can print the daily plans. There's supplies. So somebody needs, fire equipment. They have warehouse, kind of like a mini warehouse set up.
Wow.
And, I'd go and I'd get an extra sleeping bag to put under my sleeping bag to have a cushier bed to sleep on.
Nice.
Anyway, it's like a small town.
Yeah.
But this fire camp was located in a place where the fire was going to be getting there eventually. And when I got there, I knew that. And, I had some regrets about the fire behavior analyst, and I should have said, here is our prediction of when we think the fire is going to come to camp. Because I think we did have enough information, but the people in charge kind of knew about when it was going to come to camp. But one of the big lessons I learned is like a little information goes a long way. I've been working with the fire observers, so somebody whose job it is to go out and observe what the fire is doing. And they report to the fire behavior analyst, and they take weather observations and such. So I knew how the fire was behaving, and I knew what was going on. But people who were working in the kitchen didn't have that knowledge and were really traumatized by the fire coming to the edge of camp. It didn't come through camp, it came to the edge of camp. This was a week to the day after the South Canyon fire, where a number of firefighters were killed in a burnover, and these people were traumatized. I talked to a few later who I had spent time with that night, and she says, every time I close my eyes, I see flames. And I'm thinking, I wish I remembered it that vividly, because it was so interesting. But just a little bit of extra information I had made a difference to how I felt. We went to a large, open, grassy, green grass meadow. I knew we were safe there. I knew we were very safe there because of the information that I had. And these other people were ready to just take off running through the woods to some fictitious lake they had heard about that was a mile away. So if you give people information, it will keep them safer, because they won't go making what seems like a reasonable decision, run to the lake, which is actually a dangerous thing to be doing, running around willy-nilly at night. I was on some other fires that we would say blew up. They became plume dominated, which is when it looks like a big thunderstorm, or one fire, it looked like Mount Pinatubo went off. And that one was pretty scary. That was also in 1994 in Idaho. And what was very satisfying was I was doing balloon theodolites. I had a balloon theodolite, which is the theodolite is the instrument that tracks the balloon. You
Thank you.
let go of the balloon and you track it. Pieball is what they call the balloon. So you let the balloon go. It has a known ascent rate. You track it. You put the information into a calculator, and you can tell what the winds are aloft. So I had done that in the morning and did that early afternoon and went, oh, those are stronger winds than I expected. Relayed that information out to the field, and they started pulling people off of the line because of that information. And later it came back to me, somebody's comment was that I had saved their butts that day.
Wow.
And it would have become obvious relatively quickly that they needed to be off of the fire line. Maybe my information gave them another 15, 20 minutes, half an hour. And so some of the crews who had walked into their position ended up having to get helicoptered out because the trail that they had taken in ended up getting burned over. And that really highlighted to me, you need to be on top of your game in this. You need to be as sharp as you can be, because people are counting on this, not just to stop the fire, but to keep themselves safe.
Yep.
And be prepared.
Can you share with us what you shared with me recently about how firefighters, like in Alaska, in forested areas, will actually parachute out of airplanes? Could you tell us about that? I'm still fascinated.
It's the coolest job ever, except for I thought my job was the coolest job ever. But not just in Alaska, but it's also in quite a bit of the Western US. There are areas that you need to get firefighters to that are really inaccessible. There's two ways to do that: helicopter or an airplane. And helitack is what they call the people that will go in and rappel down out of a helicopter. But smoke jumpers, they will parachute into a remote area with their gear, and they are suited up. They've got Kevlar suits, so if they land in a tree, they don't get skewered. They've got ropes to let them down out of a tree if they end up hung up in a tree or their parachutes hung up in a tree. But then they also drop a bunch of paracargo, which is chainsaws and fuel and food, the so-called fresh food box, which is some fresh food and MREs that'll feed them for 3 days. They have pumps, so they can set up, find a water source, set up hose and pumps and sprinklers. So in Alaska, there might be a remote cabin that needs protecting, and they will set up a sprinkler system and maybe burn out around that cabin with the sprinkler system going. Or they will start trying to put a line around a fire. They might catch the fire on that first day. Maybe it takes a few days or weeks. Maybe what happens is they're the first ones there, but it's beyond what the 2 to 8 to 16 smoke jumpers can handle, and they bring in, more firefighters, or it ends up being a type 1 fire. We have some that smoke jumpers are the first ones on scene, but it ends up being a type 1 fire with a whole big village and all the logistics that go along with supporting those efforts. And kind of thinking about the fire community and the scouting community. And one thing about the smoke jumpers that really struck me as in developing leadership is, even if you're a rookie, it's your first year as a smoke jumper. If you're a smoke jumper, you've had a few years of experience as a firefighter, and then you go through the rookie training. But as a rookie, if you're the first person out of the plane, is the incident commander. They're the ones in charge. And so even in your first year, you will have the opportunity to be in charge of fighting a particular fire. There will be other experienced smoke jumpers with you that can guide you and aid you and advise you, but you have the opportunity to take on that responsibility. And the scouts also, they give kids and youth the opportunity to take on responsibilities with the safety net of some guidance there. And I thought that was a really fascinating thing. And
They're like the Navy SEALs of firefighting.
They really are. I asked one man who I'd known for many years, says, every time I see a story about the smoke jumpers, they call you elite. Are you guys really elite? And the way he answered the question, it was, yes, and you shouldn't have asked the question. But I do know one smoke jumper who his first fire jump, he was first out of the plane. He was the incident commander, and it was in Alaska, and it was at his hometown. So there was a fire just outside his hometown, and they, called it in, and they knew the smoke jumpers were coming. And who's first out of the plane? Togi.
Hometown hero.
Hometown hero. Yeah, that was pretty special.
Aw, that's great. What a great story. Yeah, I'm fascinated by these types of roles that we don't hear about necessarily. It's location specific, perhaps. I'm not really sure, but yeah, that is phenomenal. So now that you're retired, are you going to write a novel that includes meteorology?
Probably not, but I'll recommend a novel that includes meteorology. And these two novels were, the author is George R. Stewart, and I believe he was a Californian. His best known books are Ordeal by Hunger, about the Donner Party, weather related, a lot of snow, and also there was sort of a post-apocalyptic one, Earth Abides. But he also wrote a book called Storm, and it's about a storm in California and how it affects the people dealing, the Department of Transportation, the airlines, the linemen who are trying to repair the electrical system, and just other people traveling. And the main character is a young junior meteorologist in San Francisco. And
Cool.
and this book takes place just in the 30s, before World War II. Then the next book he wrote that was associated with weather is called Fire. And the junior meteorologist has returned from World War II, where he did weather on an aircraft carrier, and now he gets assigned to fire weather in Northern California, I think in the Redding area. And I read that book, Fire, while I was taking a fire behavior class, correspondence class. And the things they were writing in the book and the things I was learning in the class were the same, were similar.
Wow.
Yeah. And
Wow.
we have new techniques and technologies, but how fire burns is still the same. It burns uphill, it burns with the wind, it burns hotter during the day, it calms down at night, but not always. And no, I don't plan on writing a novel. I don't care for my voice, my written voice. And I've been involved with, my husband wrote a novel, and I was involved with editing that. And he wrote another novel, and I was like, no, not again. Which is fascinating. And I think on the editing side, I prefer to be on the editing side.
Awesome.
But
Well,
it
I
is
have
interesting.
some questions for you. Have you ever chased a tornado?
Yes, I sort of. I tried. I
Okay.
went 3 or 4 times with a former classmate of mine. We'd fly into Oklahoma City and then go where we thought the tornadoes might be. Never saw a tornado. We saw a near tornado one day. The sky was green, and the thunderstorm was rotating, and then we had like golf ball hail, and it was all very thrilling. But one year there was just big high pressure, and so we went to Carlsbad Caverns and Palo Duro Canyon instead. But when I worked for a couple of years in Pocatello, Idaho, and I was working one day, and there was a tornado at work. And what was really interesting to me was the radar system is designed to identify the circulation in a storm, and it did. It first, went whop whop, and said that this storm, this thunderstorm has rotation. And so we were watching it, and it was like right outside, and then it went, made some other noise, and it said, we are seeing a signature of a tornado. And we went outside, and there was a small a small, skinny, ropey tornado.
Wow, cool,
Yeah.
cool. And what is your favorite type of cloud?
I would probably have to say, see, now as soon as I pick one, I think, oh, those are really cool too. You know, a cumulonimbus has so much going on, and with the mammatus and they're so powerful and interesting. But lenticular clouds, those are the ones that look like, so wave clouds. And where I live now in Fairbanks, we are north of the Alaska range. So when we have certain weather conditions with southerly winds, you get the lenticular clouds, but then you have these waves that just kind of go on through the whole sky. And that's very cool too. But yes, I would have to say cumulonimbus because they're the most like exciting.
Okay, and what is your favorite season?
I don't think I have one. I liked winters more when I first moved to Alaska, but I like them less as I get older because they're dark and so cold, which is why I go to Texas in the winter.
Gotcha.
And it's different in different places. So spring in Alaska is like the time between when the snow melts and the leaves come out. I would call it the ugliest time of year here. It's kind of gray and all the garbage that's been in the snow is popping out. People haven't cleaned up yet. But the green up in Alaska, in Fairbanks, when the leaves come out, it can, because of our long days, it can sometimes be like 2 days. It's like an explosion of green. So one day it's just all these bare branches, and 2 days later, or even one, through the course of a day, there's these bright green leaves.
Wow.
Just beautiful. It's like ka on day one and boom on day two.
I like that.
But then the autumn with the colors, and yeah.
So my next question for you is, what is your favorite body of water?
I gotta say San Francisco Bay. How could I not? It's besides being beautiful,
it's dynamic.
Interesting. And dynamic and interesting. And if I could go back in time to see anything, I've got a few different things I'd like to see. And one would be San Francisco Bay before the Europeans showed up.
Yeah.
To see what a paradise it was before we built things out and did landfill and such things as that.
There's one theory that the Golden Gate Bridge, that opening that creates that Venturi effect between the waters that come out of the Sacramento River and the ocean, did not exist, and that there must have been a big earthquake there to, that land just came down and abridged the two, that they think that the bay was a lake at one time.
Oh, interesting. Well, the water had to get out somehow.
I know.
And the Golden Gate isn't that wide. And if you think of the large area that it drains, that water basin of, all the west side of the Sierras, there was always a river going through there. I think the shoreline used to be further offshore. Mm-hmm. But we're relying here on what I might have remembered reading in an article at some point.
Yeah, because some of the reports that I read were about the Spanish explorers did not report the opening there. And of course, as a native San Francisco, I'm like going, yeah, that's because there was too much fog.
That's right. There was too much fog.
But they did a great job, depicting the rest of California's shoreline. So it is kind of interesting. But I do have another question for you. What is the first thing that you think of when you hear the phrase rough seas?
Don't want to be there. And I used to forecast rough seas. I mean, not that specific term, but I would forecast wave heights, and that was fun.
So as a meteorologist, what is kind of a formal, definition of rough seas, if you recall?
I don't recall. I mean,
What usually would
no, I don't.
be part and parcel of that definition, right? Would there be wind?
It
Would
would be wind and probably, well, what would go into forecasting is wind, duration, and also fetch. What distance has that wind been blowing at that speed across the water? So, if you have a long, skinny lake and you've got 20-mile-an-hour winds that go across the skinny part, your waves aren't going to be that big. But if it goes along the long, parallel to the long direction, you will get bigger waves. So we had a little chart, a little graphic chart where you'd find the speed and then the fetch and then the duration.
Neat.
To forecast. But when you're forecasting winds, sometimes, or when you're looking at the seas, it's not just the wave height, but the period, like 10 feet every 12 seconds versus 10 feet every 6 seconds. So it's a little choppier.
Neat. Okay. We're going to ask some boat questions here. What is your helm preference? Tiller or wheel?
Tiller.
Woohoo! Okay. Bow or stern?
Oh, that's a tough one. Bow's more fun, but stern, you're presumably at the tiller. But I remember being on the bow, sailing in the bay, and if we'd hit the wake from a ferry boat, and if you jumped and it jumped just right, the wave would come under you over the bow, and you would land with dry feet.
Yes. Getting air.
Yes.
All right. Last question of the day. What is your favorite drill? Man overboard drill or fire in the cabin?
Oh, man overboard. Fire in the cabin. Wow, that's not interesting. Man overboard. You got to figure out how to sailing come about and get safely to the thing or person in the water.
Exactly. So Sharon, is there anything else you'd like to add for our listeners today?
I probably won't remember it until tomorrow. Just that
you can always add it in the comments.
At the beginning, you had the quote in the beginning of Shakedown Cruise from Wind in the Willows and messing around in boats. And I didn't read that book until maybe about 3 years ago. And it struck me there were so many different things in that book that are not just for kids. It's about responsibilities for your friends and responsibilities for irresponsible friends. Yes, poor Mr. Frog has so many problems, but just the caring for your friends as you go on your adventures. But yeah, I live in kind of a landlocked place here, and I spend my winters in Texas where there is very little water, and I miss the proximity of that salt air and the fog, and I'm so thankful for my opportunities to sail and in the Sea Scouts, and I'd encourage young people to take advantage of the programs that are out there, because there are programs out there that will get you out. You don't need to be rich to go sailing when there's like the Sea Scouts. We were not a bunch of rich San Francisco kids. There was really quite a variety of.
I think Stephen Welsh just reported on our podcast that it's like $11 a month.
I didn't know that. That's great.
It's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
And
your ship that you join may have other fees for other things, like the
yeah,
uniform, right? Um,
yeah.
and you have to pay for your trips, which, I did with my babysitting and lawn watering jobs as a young teenager. Um,
Well,
yeah,
yeah. And the the Girl Scout troop that I belonged to, that also was a Sea Scout ship, which was before you got into the Scouts.
correct.
And the leaders were geniuses in figuring out how to make fantastic trips affordable to any girl. This was a Girl Scout troop, and we went to Jamaica and spent time in Florida and sailed in the Bahamas. And as a high schooler living in the city, the opportunity to do that was pretty special. And
Absolutely.
there were kids, there were girls that went on that trip that were not from advantageous, money. None of us had, you
It
know,
was life changing for
unlimited
them.
disposable income. So
Yeah.
the opportunities are the
Yeah. It's rich with opportunity. And I'm always astonished by the wealth of character development that occurs in scouting, at least in Sea Scouting, because I didn't really do the other form of scouting. And so I love having all the alumni of the scouting program come on and share with people, hey, this is where it took me. And I just really love the fact that we had other friends who went into meteorology and had, great time in that arena. So it is a big part of the whole maritime environment, and I think every sailor knows just enough on out on the water to keep an eye on what's going on and when to take action, and the old axioms like red sky in the morning, sailor's warning, red sky at night, sailor's delight. And I don't know if Sharon, your camera just went off. I don't know if you can still hear us, but we are at the end of our podcast, and it looks like Sharon lost her internet. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And um, we have Sharon back here online.
We went away. You were garbled before it cut off. So I think I know what you were saying. I guess another thing, my experience in the Scouts also kind of set me up to be a bit of a joiner. When I moved to Fairbanks the first time, I, through encouragement of a coworker, became a volunteer tutor with the Literacy Council, and also got involved with the Sister City program and helped coordinate some of the homestays with that. But just not being afraid to get, being comfortable getting involved with
Yeah.
community things. It can be very rewarding.
It really does support community involvement. I mean, part of our projects for
Yes.
leadership was to extend ourselves and utilize the human resources of your crew who are the same age as you and bring them out and do good work. So it really was a tremendous program. And I just can't imagine where I would be today without that program. It really was phenomenal. And this is my way of giving back so that, the younger generations get to have a little peek into the wide variety of career opportunities and much, much more. So, Sharon, thank you so much for being here today with us. It was
You're
such a
welcome.
pleasure to formally interview you. And I look forward. I'm going to be consulting with you on weather for the
Uh-oh.
next series. I know I am going to pick your brain. I'm going to have you
Gladly.
review what I write before I publish my next book or two.
As I said, I'm much more interested in editing than writing.
Right, and that's perfect. So thank you, because I know I'm going to be using you as my meteorology consultant for future Caribbean thunderstorms.
Oh dear.
Oh, it'll be fun. Don't worry. All right, honey. Thank you so much.
Okay.
And
You're
thank
welcome,
you,
Ann.
everyone. So long.
So long.